creating a creature that can cast spells and being able to properly figure out how strong that creature actually is in terms of challenge rating is a little more complicated than just basic math. So let's talk about that. Hey fellow Game Masters, I'm Richard Quiner, and welcome back to the Daily D20, your daily dose of all things tabletop role-playing games, helping you build your world and master your game. Today I wanted to go back to our monster creation series. We're almost done. There's this one and one more video after that. And today I just want to talk about spellcasting for our creatures, because it can throw kind of a big wrench in our system of how we determine challenge rating and how strong these monsters are. And the rules for these are kind of scattered throughout the rule book, so it's not exactly a one and done, read these and this is how you do it kind of process in the Dungeon Master Guide, but I wanted to try and simplify it for you so you don't have to go through pain and suffering that I did. So as we get into spellcasting for our creatures, we need to understand a couple basic concepts, namely spellcasting, innate spellcasting, and psionics. Now psionics, I'll just start off with that. It's a real simple, easy thing. It just means that the creature can cast spells with its mind, and you'll see this in the monster manuals. You'll find creatures that have kind of mental powers. This usually means there's no difference in the rules for that creature, except that they don't really need to use material components to cast their spells because it's all in their brain. So I would say for that, that's all you need to know. If you want to make a psionic creature, you can just use that more as a flavor kind of thing, and then use the rest of the rules to actually figure out the math behind it. Now, when you tag a creature as a spellcasting creature, that essentially means that your creature is kind of like a player character of a spellcasting class. So, good things you need to know are different spellcasting classes that the players have available to them, and wouldn't it be great if there was like a series of videos on those? There is, I did it. So that's good information for you to know about spellcasting for your creatures, is they are basically a spellcasting class. So when you decide to make a creature a spellcasting creature, you're going to essentially look at it, determine what spellcasting class that creature would be. Then determine what level that creature would be compared to your players, and I highly recommend you pick a level much higher than your players, because 4 versus 1 is a lopsided fight anyways, so you want to make your creature a little bit stronger. Then after you determine those things, then you just look in the player handbook for that spellcasting class, whether it be wizard or sorcerer or bard or something of the like. You find the little table that tells you how many spells and spell slots and different spell slot levels that spellcasting class gets at that level, and then you go to the back of the player handbook and you just pick your spells for your creature. That's essentially it. That's how spellcasting works. The spellcasting creatures are under the same restrictions that the players are under. You have spell slots, you have spell slot levels that come into play. You only have a certain amount of spell slot levels per long rest. Sometimes you can cast a spell at a higher level spell slot if you have a higher level spell slot available to you as a creature. So it's essentially like playing a spellcasting character, but it's a creature instead of an actual player. So a little side note on this, sometimes the spellcasting classes benefit from a subclass, like paladins or clerics have their domains and their oaths that gives them a little bonus to their spellcasting ability. That can also come into play for your creature that you're creating. If you want to create a creature that is kind of a necromantic kind of creature, they might have some of the domain of death involved in them, in which case they would have more spells available to them as a spellcasting class. I hope this is making sense, because this is still just the basics. All in all, easy way to explain it is just treat your creature like it's a player character, or like you're making a player character, and then just pick the spells that you would want for that creature. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Next, though, is innate spellcasting. Innate spellcasting is a little different, because the word innate means that it's something that the creature just has. It's like a natural ability that the creature has, kind of like sorcerers, just kind of, but instead of being, oh, I'm a sorcerer and all this is inside of me and I can learn to control it, these are creatures where it's more just like a natural thing. It's like a dog barking or a cat meowing. They just can cast some spells. You can go ahead and pick certain spells for your innate spellcasting creatures, just following similar rules. Pick a spellcasting class, pick the spells for that class, and then you're good. Except the innate spellcasting class has a couple rules that go into play on top of that method there. One big one is innate spellcasters can't really cast spells at higher level spell slots. If they have a spell, they can automatically if they have a spell available to them, they can only really cast it at the lowest possible level of that spell. This, I think, is more of a, just makes sense. If it's just something natural that you haven't learned and studied, you're not going to be very good at it, so you're just going to cast it at the lowest possible level. Also, innate spellcasting creatures don't get to swap out spells willy-nilly like some of the other spellcasting classes can. Because it's innate, it's just part of them. They don't get to learn new things or prep new spells. They have one set list, and that's all they can really cast. In addition, there are other optional rules that you can use. For example, some creatures may cast a certain spell, but the limitation on that spell might be they can only cast it on themselves, which changes how that spell is used by that creature. So consider that as well. When you're making your creature, are they doing spells that they will cast on themselves? Are they doing spells that they're going to cast on others? What is the true nature of this creature's magic? And then you can kind of decide and fill in the flavor from there. So there you have the spellcasting, innate spellcasting, and the psionics, the little brother of all of these. But now we need to do the math behind all these spellcasting things, so we can add that to our challenge rating to figure out how strong our creature is, to make sure we don't kill our players in the first round of combat, or to make sure we can actually kill the players in the first round of combat, depending on your DM style. When it comes to spellcasting and armor, there are pretty few spells that actually boost the armor class of a character, or a creature in that case. So all you really need to do is, if you have that spell, for example, mage armor, you just add whatever armor class modifier that gives you to your creature's effective armor class. And just note that down, because your effective armor class will be used to determine your creature's challenge rating later. That's very straightforward and simple. What gets a little more complicated and was a little harder to find in the rules is the damage output of your creature. So I am hoping I'm able to explain this in a way that you can understand pretty clearly, because it took me a little bit and I racked my brain, and I also know that I'm not a good math person. I've never been a good math person. I went from geometry in high school, and then I went to business math to learn to count money, and then I stopped taking math classes because I didn't like them. And now I'm here playing Dungeons and Dragons all the time. Anyways, back to the spellcasting for damage. Okay, so the damage number that we really worry about when determining a creature challenge rating is its damage per round. Normally that's determined by physical attacks, whether it's melee or ranged versions of those attacks, and you determine how much damage the creature does per round on average, and then that determines the creature's challenge rating. But when it comes to spellcasting, you have more limitations, right? So you can cast certain spells, but you have spell slots that come into play. So maybe your creature only has one level 5 spell slot, and that's their big hard hitter spell, but they can only cast that once. So their challenge rating, effectively, if you think about it that way, would dip. It'd be like, oh, I can hit really hard like a truck, but then after that, I'm just a bee sting kind of thing. So when it comes to determining the overall damage output, or damage output per round of spells, what you need to do is basically look at your character that you've created, your creature's spell list. Figure out the spells that do the most damage for the first 3 rounds of combat. This includes how many spell slots you will use, actions, bonus actions, these sort of things, and you just figure out what is the most damage that you can do with these spells in 3 rounds of combat. Now that you have those spells determined and what your creature would cast in those first 3 rounds, then you determine the average damage output of those spells. Now, if you remember, there is a formula for determining the average damage per die, and there's a whole list. Essentially, you take the max number you can roll on a die, add 1 to that, then divide that by half, and then multiply that by how many dice you're going to be rolling, and then that is your average damage. There's plenty of tables online, and you could probably just go on Google and look up average 2d8 damage or something like that, and it will probably tell you. There's a lot of resources out there, so I'm not going to dive into that in depth. But once you have the average damage of each of those attacks that you do for your first 3 rounds for your creature, you're going to add those together, so you have an overall. Then you're going to divide that by 3 to get your average damage per round for your creature. That is the number we'll use to determine our creature challenge rating. It's essentially the same as looking at a creature and saying, oh, on my round, I can attack 4 times with my dagger, and then adding the average damage of all those dagger attacks to create the damage per round for that creature. That's essentially what you're doing, except you have more options with spells, so you have to think a little more critically about what spells your creature would use in the first 3 rounds and come up with that. Once you note down your spell damage per round, you're pretty much ready to figure out your actual challenge rating of your creature, but that will be in another video. If you're ready to finish up your creature, go ahead and click this video over here. And if you want to go back and review some of the other videos, go ahead and click the video over here. Anyways, I've been Richard Quiner. Thanks for watching.